So, here we are, the first annual Northeastern University Global Summit. I'm going to be inviting in just a few moments to the stage a speaker, all the way from Ireland. He currently serves as the Deputy Chief Executive of the Chambers Ireland, in charge of partnerships in charge of public affairs and stakeholder partnerships, He's in charge of the development and coordination of network policy and agenda, as well as communication with government, political parties, and social partners. Please help me in welcoming Sean Murphy to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I'm really, really delighted to be here. And it's a great city. It's a great country. I've lived here for a couple of years. It was a pleasure to live here. And I'm just delighted to give you my own views on what we've been through. And in many ways, Ireland could be a microcosm for what's happened in the macrocosm. So everything that has been spoken about earlier regarding the job destruction, the dry heaving moments of corporates, our major utilities which needed multi-billion euros in funding to roll over as they rolled out future infrastructural investments, were kind of going, what are we going to do? All those kind of fears were replicated, albeit in somewhat micro format in Ireland. So that's maybe the context in which I come to you today. Just a few thank yous. I'd like to thank Northeastern, the student leadership team for this great event. I wish you every success in the future. Wells Fargo for sponsoring this event. When I lived in California, I didn't have an account with Wells Fargo. I clearly was wrong in that regard, and if I ever go back, I'll get it right next time. Damari McKim, and obviously the Dean, Hugh Courtney as well. And I should also thank Anne Murphy Benware for arranging all the details for me beforehand. No direct relation, but somewhere way back when, I guess, Just in terms of running through what we've been through, it's kind of scary that I'm 42. I actually start to reflect on my life so far. I feel like I'm only 22, like you or whatever, but in 1988, I was an 18-year-old working in London for the summer as a student on Burrell's Wharf. It was a construction site at the time. You can just see Canary Wharf, where Lehman Brothers European headquarters was based, just there in the background. And this was a site where Isenberg Kingdom Brunel built the first ironclad ship, the original Ironsides, if you know what I mean. And it's now a luxury apartment block, and it's very nice. At the end of the summer, the site was shut down, and everybody was laid off. I didn't mind because I was going back to college in late September, but a lot of guys were losing their jobs. And what actually happened was there was a building boom in London, and it ended. And people stopped spending money, and so the builders had to shut down. Now, right now, this is a picture taken recently. If you go on TripAdvisor, it's got 4-star reviews for being a lovely place to live. Clearly was, because I worked there. But it's a sign that these type of things can happen and do happen in cycles everywhere. So over the course of your lives, all things being equal, at least every 10 years, some would say every 4 years, there's going to be a downturn. And in the downturn, if you're working in the private sector, people are going to look at who's adding value to the organization. And that's a kind of a scary thing. You have to continue to say, how are you adding value to your organization to justify your existence in that role? And I wish somebody had said that to me earlier in my career. I would have been more sensitized to that reality. It's kind of hammered into accountants from year one, from their first day of training. Who's adding value? And in the good times, you can get away, you can quote unquote hide, but in the bad times, unfortunately, those that aren't adding value get hit. And that's something that I've learned over my career. I lived in San Francisco for just over 2 years, between late 99 and 2002. So I was here for the dot-com boom. When I arrived over, the real estate agents were arrogant beyond belief. I would go to look at apartments and there would be no application forms because they had run out of application forms. It was an absolute bubble. I lived on the 12th floor, around about there, and Eileen Quinn is a VP in Wells Fargo, and a cousin of mine who's here today would have visited me there. It was a lovely apartment, 3 blocks north of Union Square, 2 blocks west. 2 years later, the real estate agents were begging people to rent off them, begging. My commute down to San Mateo County dropped by about 5 minutes a month as less cars appeared in the road, and that was the result of the downturn. So again, 10 years later, from 1988 effectively, another downturn happens. Commutes go easy, things happen, there's a shakeout. San Mateo County's office vacancy rate went from something like 6% to around about 20% over a 6-month period. Pretty shocking stuff. It's right back at it now. I would argue probably, I haven't been there recently, but I suspect it's another bubble that's there right now. And again, you've got to think about that in terms of human psychology. We forget these things as we live in the bubble, but this happens. And crazy things happen, and people make stupid, silly, foolish decisions on the back of the fact that there's an ongoing feedback loop, and a positive or a negative feedback loop going on. So I'll go on here a little bit. While I was living in San Francisco, I remember listening to NPR in the morning one day, and a guy from the National Home Builders Association or some name like that was in a debate with Robert Shiller, who produces the Case-Shiller Index of house property prices in the US and various other markets. And I took the book out and read it, and thank God I did, because when I came back to the bubble that was Ireland, this was all in my brain the whole time, and I didn't do anything crazy with regard to what property I felt I should have justified to myself to live in. So I bought a modest house. I'm still in it. So the downturn hasn't been very tough in my work career, but in my personal balance sheet it hasn't been so horrendous, as it has been for many of my generation, and especially for those 5 and 6 years younger than me who had to buy their first home in a bad location, a long way from the city centre, and are now strapped with pretty significant debts on an asset that's probably halved in value, or maybe 60% of that value. But this book, it's a good read, and it just shows you that people are out there making comments. Pay attention to them. This is not to demonize Ronald Reagan, because I think on balance he was a great guy. On balance, he faced off the Soviet Union, delivered freedom in East Europe and many other countries. But the context in which light touch regulation happened, I would argue, happened during the time of Reagan. And I think this phrase is a pithy phrase. Government's view of the economy could be summed up in a few short phrases. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And on a personal level, from a personal ideology perspective, I kind of get what he's getting at there. But sometimes you do have to regulate. And government has a different role to business. And we always have to be aware of that. In whatever country we're in, government has to look after A to Z, whereas business is looking after A to H, shareholders, stakeholders, customers, workforce. It's a different perspective to the broader generality of the economy. And I would think that the reason why banks were heavily regulated back then was as a direct result of the crash in the 20s. Investment banks were separated from retail banks. Retail banks had a specific role. In deregulating it, we had the first bite of the cherry here in the United States, I would argue, from the savings and loan crisis in the early 1980s. It only cost the US 3.2% of GDP, which is still a huge number, but it was only 3.2% of GDP. But in that ongoing deregulate, the shareholders and the boards will do their job, the markets, Standard & Poor's, they'll all do their job. We kind of forgot, and not perhaps, in my view, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. And the result of that, I would argue, was initially the great reduction in interest rates, the provision of almost free money to everyone. But then, when the market turned from greed, in inverted commas, to fear, in inverted commas, and the real value of risks got being priced into the price of money, then you had this global heart attack in the West, I would argue. So just to say, he did say, if it keeps moving, regulate it, and if it stops moving, subsidize it. Well, we deregulated it, we got irrational exuberance, and ultimately we ended up with the TARP program, which the US federal government made a profit on, but it was about buying troubled, stranded assets at a price to take them off the balance sheet of challenged banks. I would exclude Wells Fargo in that regard. They had a once-in-a-generation opportunity, as I understand it, to buy Wachovia, because Wachovia bid off more than it could chew. And I'm not quite sure the machinations of how TARP helped fund that, but it clearly would have underpinned that purchase. But the point is, in deregulating, ultimately the taxpayer had to step in with a bigger price to fix the mess afterwards. And thankfully for the United States federal government and for the taxpayer, ultimately, as I understand, it's been almost a profit for the US federal government. But there was a big risk at the time that mightn't be the case. And markets did freeze. And ultimately, during the bad times, our own business faced some really difficult challenges. And ultimately, if you can't pay your debts and you can't pay the wages next Thursday, whether you're a corporate employing 1,000 staff or 10 staff, your business is bust. And if the market freezes and you've got to roll over a debt that's a 3-year debt on an asset that takes 20 years to build and pay for, such as a power station, if you don't have the cash to pay it, you've broken your covenants. You are broke, even if you have run that business correctly, or that state for that matter. That's just one of my experiences. This is Ireland in the Noughties. This is a beautiful building. We had some really good times in the Noughties when I came back. The Noughties, as I always say. This was designed by Daniel Libeskind, a star-architect, built by, I don't know if you ever see the movie Rattle and Hum. It's a concert of U2's hit album. It was built by the developer behind that building. The Marker Hotel to the left is a fantastic building now. Here it's a beautiful hotel. It was mothballed for about 6 years. It's reopened recently with Irish and American ownership, and it's doing really well. It was built on Misery Hill, actually, which is a fantastic name for an area where in the Middle Ages pirates used to be hung alive and left to rot. That kind of contextualized it, but now it's a new city and it's a beautiful building. And it was built at a time when, pre-crisis Ireland had almost full employment, effectively full employment. If you go below 4%, you really are full employment. Debt as a percentage of GDP was less than 30%. We were running significant tax surpluses, and we had 2.2 million people in employment. Again, Ireland is the size of New York State, so, in the 19th century at peak there was 8 million people there. Even now there's only about 6 in the whole island. But the population had effectively doubled since the 1950s and was in a good place. Sorry, I'll just go on here. So we built, in that last 10 years, we built great motorways, a couple of great airports. This is a scene from Dublin Airport. It's a fantastic airport we built, fantastic electrical and broadband networks. So we did some things right. On average, 18% of Ireland's energy is produced by wind at this stage, and on a windy day, 40% of that energy is produced by wind. And you need good electrical cabling to do that. And on the back of the electrical investments, we also invested in a very good fibre optic cable network that kind of hugs around the electrical cabling. So we did some good things right. But we were over-reliant on construction. At peak, 1 in 6, sometimes maybe 1 in 5 men were involved in construction in the mid-noughties, the mid-2000s. The other thing we did was, around about 2004, I'll cover it later, but around about 2004, the EU expanded to embrace more countries from the former Soviet Union, from the former Warsaw Pact, places like Poland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Those last 3 were in the Soviet Union. They were in Russia at the time. And Ireland, Britain, and one other country in the EU gave all of these people free access to move to Ireland and work from day one. Now, what that translated into was we had unlimited supply of labour. Unlimited. Just put that in context. In the boom, we had a housing boom, which was ultimately transformed into a property bubble through excessive credit creation, because we had joined the Eurozone, the European Union monetary union, and we had a common currency, the euro, which is still alive after some significant heart attacks as well. And in doing and enjoying the euro, we as a state and our banks and all our institutions got access to effectively free money for the first time ever. Before that, we had to pay a lot more interest because there was a higher risk on lending to Ireland than would have been the case in the Eurozone, where globally everyone said, oh, they're in the Eurozone. Germany somewhere or other is underpinning that. So effectively you're getting money for the price of Deutschmarks. And it's cheap. And that in turn generated huge buoyancy in taxes. We don't, and we didn't until last year, have an annualised property tax in Ireland. Instead, our state hit you really hard with an upfront tax of 9% on a house purchase, which is pretty savage. But if you're selling lots of houses, that meant the taxes from that one line item were huge, and not to mention the sales taxes on top of that. So it enabled the government and successive governments to be profligate. They could give money to everyone, money for anything. You want money, we'll give it to you, because our taxes are rocketing. And even IMF program reviewers would have come in and said the Irish are doing everything right. So even from an external actor's point of view, everyone was saying you're doing things right. And it did kind of fit with the program. Everybody likes the underdog to be doing well. We all want that. But sometimes you need more people, being Cassandra, saying, hey, there's more problems there. You need to do more. You need to be saving for the future. You need to pay down that debt. Actually, ironically, we did pay down the debt because we got it below 30% of GDP. But we were profligate with our spending and we undertaxed. We never introduced a property tax, something that my organisation called for right throughout the noughties. We didn't have water taxes. We do now. We now have a property tax. You name the tax, we have it in place now. But we didn't then. This is a hell of a risque picture, but it actually featured on multiple billboards around Dublin in 2007. I've never seen a suburban kitchen in that situation before. I never shall. If you saw our security guard, Lukas Popolski, he's a Polish security guard in our office. He lives in this estate now. I don't think he lives like that. But so pre-crisis, we had an inadequate design of the euro, and we had a failed and damaged European oversight of the euro area. And by that, what I'm saying is we had centralised monetary policy, but we had decentralised fiscal or tax-raising powers. So not everybody was raising the taxes at the same time in the same context. And we didn't have the same level of implementation. And that meant the countries that really shouldn't have gone into the Eurozone got in. And I would say it's a great country, I love it, but Greece probably shouldn't have joined the Euro at the time it did. And it did manipulate the books. With the help of you need to go online, you'll see some major banks around the world helped them manipulate their numbers to get into the Eurozone. And they became, to pardon the pun, an Achilles heel, a weak point in the Eurozone's architecture. So that was one context. The other was in terms of, in the absence of a common fiscal and monetary union, you don't have the situation like you have here in the States, where if Massachusetts has and goes through a very hard time, the federal government comes through with funding in terms of everything from military spending to procurement spending to investments in MIT, through to the ability of Americans to move around the United States. Whereas in Europe, you have 28 countries, multiple languages, different cultures. Ireland is lucky in that we are Anglophone, so we have easy access to Boston, we have easy access to America, Canada, Australia, and Britain. London's on our doorstep. But for other countries, it's less. They have less flexibility in where people locate themselves. So what were our domestic drivers? Public sector salaries roared up and soared. This is a quote from a trade union leader in the 2003 pay talks. I won't read it out to you, but it says it all really. And on the back of the bubble and the boom, construction services and banking rocketed as well. We had brickies, the guys who lay the bricks in a building site, being paid €1 per brick, which is a hell of a number, It's a hell of a number. And so guys were buying property. People were buying property in places like Bulgaria who didn't know where Bulgaria was, but they had super revenues at the time and they thought they could afford it. And that happened. I'm sure Spain would have gone through similar experiences as well, and I look forward to hearing your speaker address that later on also. We also had inappropriately qualified regulators. This man, Patrick Neary, ultimately resigned over poor regulation, but remember, he was operating in a milieu that talked about light and appropriate regulation. In fact, it talked about light regulation, and now the mantra is appropriate regulation, and appropriate has to be a whole lot heavier than what it was heretofore. But, he really was not up to the job. If you read Michael Lewis's articles in Vanity Fair, where he travelled to some of the challenged countries post-bust, there's a quote in it, a very choice quote, I'll edit the language in it, but there was a professor of economics in UCD who said that when this guy appeared in the telly, deep down most Irish people felt there was a little old guy somewhere who knew what to do and managed the banks, and then this guy appeared in the telly and everyone, oh my God, we don't know what we're doing. And again, unfortunately, that did happen. So, and again, remember, this is a microcosm for effectively most of the West. Artificially low interest rates, too low, drive up household and business debt levels. Because the cash, the price of money is cheap, so therefore the business case to buy that property, buy another property, buy that warehouse, buy that hotel, build that hotel, stacks up. But you got to think through cycles. I'm sorry, I've done something here now. You got to think through cycles that, you got to pay for it in the hard times and the good times, not just the easy first 3 years. It's a mortgage of 20 or 30 years. You got to think longer term. So this led to a rapid rise in debt levels. It's from a stockbroking firm here, but the household debt level, you just look at that, 2002, it's less than, it's just over 100%. It rocketed to north of 200%, which was pretty savage. It's still pretty high. It's falling, but it's got a long way to go. We're going to have to grind for a long time. We need a big dose of inflation to get that down to more realistic and manageable levels. I'm just going to show the first 2 minutes of this video. You can, you'll excuse the moody music and the gravelly voiceover, but it's actually, the first 2.5 minutes set the context in which our banks were operating. One bank in particular, Anglo-Irish Bank, was getting incredible returns on capital employed, off the scale returns. But in retrospect, the reason why it wasn't provisioning for the bad times. And the one thing I'd say is, and the only thing we've learned yet is, they, combined with some international banks moving into Ireland, in particular Bank of Scotland Ireland, which was a British bank, which ultimately went bust in Britain, chased the market. They started offering 100% mortgages. You didn't have to put any money down. So it wasn't subprime per se, but they changed the market and forced all the other banks to respond. And that's where our regulator and our government and our whole regulatory authorities should have said, no, you got to put up 20% deposit. You got to have a strong track record of saving. You can't give 100%. You can't give really crazy interest rate deals on it. And that's where I would say a weakness that I still don't see being fixed was, where were the financial analysts from the independent entities in the conference calls on a quarter-by-quarter basis asking the questions, really going hard? And rather than saying, why can't you get the return on capital employed and the dividend payments out of Anglo in your bank, why were they saying, why isn't Anglo being reined in to more sustainable levels? So hopefully this will work now. If you let me play.
The market that he had bet on so heavily was suddenly in trouble.
The spring of '06, prices were on fire. And then, come the summer, the market died. I mean, I work for one of the larger agents who in the first half of '06 sold 3,000 new homes. You look at a year later, in the first half of '07, they sold less than 100. I mean, the market literally turned off like a tap.
The international markets that lent to Anglo were alarmed.
The dogs in the street were barking about Anglo. They were not only selling Anglo shares, investors from overseas, particularly from overseas, they were selling them short.
International observers looking in at the Irish banking system realised that there was a very dangerous exposure to a single asset class called property.
An enormous amount of the loans which had been lent by our banks were in danger of not being repaid, particularly those that were linked to property.
This jitteriness in international markets followed the collapse of the US subprime mortgage business. Banks were now wary about lending to each other, and with Irish property also in decline, Irish banks no longer looked like a safe bet.
Welcome to a special St. Patrick's Day 6-1 news and sport. The Irish market was down with bank shares worst hit.
On St. Patrick's Day 2008, Anglo was the first to experience the changed sentiment.
The market realised the entire Irish banking system was actually funded in large part by wholesale funds that had come from outside of domestic Ireland. And international investors started to get increasingly nervous about property prices, and there was a wide-scale abandonment of the Irish banking sector. And at the top of the list was Anglo.
There were investors out there baying for blood. They recognised that there were some banks in a really weak position, and Anglo was one of those, and they moved against it that day.
As Anglo's shares plunged, Fitzpatrick's model of borrowing internationally to lend to developers locally was crumbling.
That was really the first identifiable moment in time when you could say there could be something seriously wrong in this bank.
People realised this isn't a conservative, sensibly run business. It's actually become a distinctly high-octane business using some of Wall Street's most aggressive techniques to try and drive profit growth.
Anglo was a busted flush. Its collapse could wreak havoc.
That kind of contextualizes where we were and what happened. We were borrowing from the international market to build locally, and it didn't work. So if I go back, who are the cheerleaders, or maybe even the gatekeepers is probably a better term for it. This is a quote from the book I quoted earlier on, The Fall of the Celtic Tiger. You know, all the political parties, ultimately everybody wants to give jam to the voters. That's what voters want, and it's very difficult to take the jam away. But you know, our broad-based media was tied up in property tax, property advertising. It was a big driver of revenue. Our financial regulator, our central bank, and the Department of Finance didn't have enough contrarian voices to say, hey, we got a problem here. And we're proven and the bus to not have been in control in terms of the regulatory elements. And not enough people, not no one, but not enough people shouted stop. We didn't do the kind of counter-cyclical stuff such as property taxes, water charges that many of us would, or some of us would have called for, which led to real problems. The government had to do a bank guarantee for our banks, I would argue. Our banks had effectively, initially it looked like a liquidity crisis, but actually it was an asset crisis, and the government had to step in. And the reason why the government had to step in is a bank ultimately has three roles. One is provision of credit, which is the one for which there's lots of coverage. But the other two, I think from a society point of view, are more important. Money transmission and actually store of wealth. If you don't have those last two, society really is in a bad place. And there was a real challenge, a real threat to our banks at the time. Those latter two items could have fallen through. And this could have happened in the States as well. And you know, civilization is only skin deep. There's a paper I saw recently from a government doing scenario planning, and they said that civilization is 4 meals away from ending. That if you miss 4 dinners in a row, civilization's under threat. And if your money transmission mechanism breaks down, and if your store of wealth breaks down, then you have a real challenge for your broader society. So effectively, we had to put in 30% of our GDP into our banking system. It's pretty sickening. Remember, SNL cost the US government 3.2% of GDP. This is the day the EU, IMF, ECB, Troika arrive. It's very much an iconic picture. You have the Irish post box, and you have a beggar as they walk around to the central bank to start negotiations on providing the funding, which was managed funding, guaranteeing us, because Ireland got locked out of the markets, So, we faced a liquidity crisis, and if we hadn't had the money in the bank accounts, we couldn't have paid our civil servants, couldn't have paid their welfare checks. Society could have been in a desperately bad situation. And this is in micro what many other countries around the world faced. Just we were in many ways the canary in the coal mine. We were the first guys in to hit that wall post-Lehman. So why were we first? We're a small, globalized economy, and we were first to see it, and we were the first to fess up on it. And also, we got hammered for doing so. So we had to take stuff on our balance sheet that other countries in the European Union ultimately did not have to do, because the analysis, the policies, the procedures were bedded down for future meltdowns, but we were first in. So, here's a question, impact on society. We account for just less than 1% of the EU population. As a percentage of cost in the European banking crisis, how much was borne by Ireland? I won't even ask for your vote, but the answer coming from Millman, who are actuaries in Ireland, a global brand, 43%. It's a big number for less than 1% of the population. As I said, 30% of GDP went in. And some people argue, why didn't you play hardball with the bond markets? Why didn't you as a country say you were not paying and play chicken with them? The issue is we had ramped up so much cost into the economy in terms of salaries and everything else for public servants that we needed to borrow to keep that going as we slowly wound it down. So we couldn't play chicken, I don't think. Easy for anybody to say this, but I think it was a very difficult thing to say, burn the bondholders. And also, if you burn the bondholders, then you're never going to be able to borrow off them again. Argentina faces this right now. They did burn them, and Argentina is paying a significant price for doing so. And culturally, we didn't want to go bust. As a culture, we don't want to do that. We have never done it, and thankfully, we won't do it in the future. Knock wood. So, in the context of that, we've had to do a whole lot of re-engineering of the euro. Here in America, you've had to re-engineer how your banking regulatory oversight. I saw a presentation by Chris Dodd, the guy who would have piloted through the relevant bill that brought in TARP. Again, you face similar problems and significant problems. But you had an advantage in that you had a globalized currency. We're tied into the Eurozone, which means we have a common currency with Germany. And Germany wants lower interest rates for its economy, which means it wants low inflation. Whereas what we need right now is a dose of good inflation to get the debt levels down to more manageable levels. And so we have had to do an internal devaluation within the euro, which is a lot more painful, rather than actually devaluing our currency the way the British did. They dropped 30% off the value of sterling almost overnight at the same time as ourselves. So in the short term, Mario Draghi, who runs the European Central Bank, he's an Italian, a really, really good guy, has calmed the markets by basically saying that he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, basically threatening a TARP type initiative for the euro. And that has actually led to a reduction in interest rates to more sane levels for corporates, for businesses, for states, and for Ireland as well, which means it's given us the wiggle room, the breathing space to get on with doing the ongoing reforms we need to cut our costs. But we still face challenges. Our unemployment numbers are now down again. We're creating probably 5,000 jobs a month at the present time. We're sub 12% for the first time in about 6 years. But still very high. And our long-term unemployment numbers, as in the States, are high. Short-term unemployment, there's a very good churn. How much more time do I have there, by the way, Albert? Yeah, okay, well, just Dan Doctoroff spoke at Dublin Chamber of Commerce's dinner recently. He took over as Deputy Mayor in New York after September 11th, and I think that's the phrase he had there. You got to be hopeful in the bad times and humble in the good times definitely applies. In the good times, save for the bad times, and in the bad times, you've got the cash to pay for those bad times, if you know what I mean. But it's all about having the reserves in place, containing your costs, but also being hopeful, because ultimately the dawn will come. And other reasons to be hopeful is, we have other parts of the economy that perform well. We're the fourth biggest beef exporters in the world. 1 in 5 McDonald's burgers in Europe is produced in Ireland. We have a very strong agricultural base. We also still have a very high and strong engineering base. So good engineers. Mulholland Drive in LA is named after the guy who brought water to LA, who's an Irish guy. Intel are in Ireland 25 years, and last month they announced a further €5 billion investment in expanding their plant there. That's a real stabilizer. It's a real stabilizer for the broad-based economy that's there, exclusive of construction, which has taken a massive shakeout. Just some pen pictures. This is Russia's richest woman. She's worth $30 billion, apparently. Nothing to do with the fact her husband is a former mayor of Moscow. But she bought a very high-end hotel in Dublin for €20 million last year. Donald Trump bought another hotel in the west coast of Ireland 2 months ago. John Malone, who's in page 3 of the New York Times today, has bought a castle in County Wicklow. Lots of people are buying lots of property in Ireland because they're seeing that the market's turn and they're buying in at the bottom price. And that's a good thing because we've set a floor for where we stand. And the other thing I would say, I've talked about the micro and macrocosm effects of the global financial crisis, but it is interesting that, the UN panel has come out with some pretty stark warnings on climate change. And in 2012, this superstorm that hit the United States cost insurers $30 billion, which is not far off the impact of the crisis in many, many states. So I would say there's another big challenge out there, independent of the financial crisis, that we all collectively have to face up to. And I think we can, but it's just it's an important issue to consider as well. That's it. Thank you for your interest and time, and I'll take any questions you want now or later, Albert.
Hello. Okay. So Dean Starkin, I'll be speaking later, but I really appreciated this perspective from Ireland and Europe. There was one graph that I thought was interesting there. It was very similar to the stuff we saw in the United States. You were talking about rising wages and it sounded like you were really focusing on public sector, but it sounded like you thought. But there was the graphic there that showed that rising debt to income levels. It was very similar to what was happening in the States, where we had this, very stagnant income levels or declining in some sectors across the board, whereas debt went through the roof. And that's sort of, obviously, that's the key stat that points to unsustainability of these notes. So I guess if you could speak to that a little bit, like how loose had lending gotten, and how do we think about that particular graphic?
Yeah, I mean, lending went crazy. We didn't have a subprime mortgage crisis the way you had in the States per se. It was a homegrown mortgage or crisis driven by, low interest rates and also hyper competition amongst our banking sector. I would say an output arising from this is we definitely need to split retail from investment banking, and retail needs to be treated as a strategic utility, not a utility, a strategic utility with heavy duty government oversight. And I would think the implications of that is you need less competition because, frankly, the competition went mad. You had crazy offers being provided of, tracker mortgages. They're costing the taxpayer and the Irish government about €800 million a year now from the distressed banks that they own. But basically, a tracker mortgage was a commitment by banks to sell a mortgage to people, guaranteeing they would pay no more than 0.5% of interest rate over the lowest interest rate on the European bond market. It didn't allow for bad debts and everything else, and that was a big issue. As regards to the cost base, you see the private sector righted itself pretty fast through businesses going bust and significant layoffs. The problem or challenge in the public sector is there wouldn't be the culture of layoffs, naturally, because it's a governmental sector. So the costs rocketed. There was a once-off hit of 13.5% on salaries right across the board for all public servants, which is significant. But we haven't done enough of the reforms on the cost of pensions for public servants in particular to deal with that in the future, I would say. And then I probably neglected to talk about the fact that we cut our welfare costs. We ramped up taxes very significantly. It's been a financial emergency, so marginal taxes are now just north of 50% right now. They need to fall, they will do, but it was facing up to a reality that we had to close a very significant gap between what we were spending and what we were paying or taking in taxes. So, does that answer your question, Dean? Or yeah.
I was just saying it's just interesting to parse where to target exactly where the problems lay, and it sounded eerily similar actually to the U.S. market in many ways.
Yeah. I think hyper competition and actually banks coming out of other markets who themselves thought they had much stronger balance sheets than they had, chasing the market, and then that making the more conservative banks react because they couldn't face another analyst call, getting their heads hit for not hitting the same return on capital employed.
And I assume was similar, that the mortgages were securitized and
sold?
But
we didn't have the same securitization issue. Actually, we kind of dodged that bullet. It was more German banks that bought lots and lots of what was it, the Goldman Sachs quote, A lot of lemon juice was made out of lemons and sold to German banks in particular. Our guys didn't buy that so much. This is a domestically driven bust.
So they kept the mortgages on their own books?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. They didn't. They securitized debt. They borrowed funding from international funding markets, but then they sold it through to Irish consumers and newly arrived consumers from elsewhere in the world.
You should have repackaged them and sold it to the Germans.
We should have, yeah, but hey, we didn't, But that's
next time.
That was one of the challenges.
Remember
yes,
that.
Indeed, yeah.
I'm Sean Gilbert. I'm a senior right now, graduating in May. I'm wondering if you could talk a little about how you feel regarding the long-term feasibility of the euro, given the decentralized fiscal policy, and if, has there been a move to centralize that more?
Yeah, I mean, I think at every twist in the road, the broad-based leadership of Europe who've committed to the euro have said, we're going to do whatever it takes. That's what I think. And I think if you look at the generality of the leadership in Ireland and the other 18 countries that are in the Eurozone, when push has come to shove, they've backed the euro. They've invested too much capital in it, in my humble opinion. And I think there's an ongoing further consolidation to go ahead there. And I think if you look at it in terms of ideology, that's one of the challenges we face, that what choice do we have? Because, I would say Western democracy and Western markets and the whole Western model has been fundamentally challenged by the great financial crisis. And there is a competing ideology and market out there in communist China, which personally I don't endorse or support, but it's there as an option for people. And I think that, that's why I think the transatlantic trade and investment partnership between the US and Europe is crucially important to underpin, frankly, a more open markets philosophy. So I think, when push has come to shove, we've done it. Like we've retrofitted a lot of our regulations around the financial crisis already. There's a bit more retrofitting to be done in terms of the balance sheet exercise on Ireland in particular, because the hit we've taken to sustain and support the global banking system, I would say. Like Tim Geithner would have been on to senior leadership in Europe saying, don't let Ireland let the banks die post-Lehman's. That happened, that's been documented. But we took a pretty significant bullet that we couldn't afford. We're still grappling with it. But we're going to need some more help in that, I think, at the European level, and we will get it in due course, I think.
Greg Dwyer, senior graduating in May. One question, you mentioned during the housing boom, you had immigrants from the Baltic states and everything coming to Ireland. Is this immigration early on now an issue with 12% unemployment? And it's kind of off topic, but how is Ireland dealing with getting Irish people back to work in obviously the technology sectors, but how is Ireland handling immigration?
Yeah, I mean, we've done remarkably well, I have to say. I mean, growing up in Ireland in the 1970s, it was a primarily monocultural and quite a boring place, whereas now it's a fundamentally better place with much better restaurants and food and all the kind of stuff that we see about many other countries. I mean, Dublin has 20% of the people in Dublin are born outside of Ireland. We always have had a legacy. I mean, I talked earlier to Dean Courtney. I have 3 cousins living in Boston. One's a VP in your sponsors here today. Another is a postdoc in MIT, and a third is a house painter. And we've always had those links into other markets, and we've been used to that, if you know what I mean. And I would say that culturally, in particular, the Poles and the Irish are very alike. They're very similar, and so there's been very limited difference between ourselves and themselves in particular, and they'd be our biggest minority, if you know what I mean. But it is a fact. 12%, 11.8% unemployment is too high, and there have definitely been some growing pains. There's not about that. But there hasn't been anything like, for example, the know-nothings in late 19th century US, or there hasn't been any movement like that at all. I have to say, in Ireland so far. And also, there's been a reassertion of links to other markets, such as the Boston market, in places like that. A lot of Irish people are going over there for a couple of years, going to Australia. And we're lucky that we have London on our doorstep also, and there's been no downturn in London. So that's taken a lot of the heat out, I would say, in terms of the potential negative impacts of the downturn, I would say.
I'm Professor Sheila Puffer, Professor of International Business. What incentives have been put in place in Ireland to attract foreign direct investment? You gave one example there, but in particular, Ireland was known for having very, very attractive interest rates, tax rates.
Corporation tax rates, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was very much resented by the rest of the EU. Could you please comment on those two things?
Yeah, and actually when our current Prime Minister took power, he faced a lot of pressure to change our corporation tax rates. But, you know, our model of a low corporation tax rate has been in place since the 1950s. And I guess every market, every region, every area has to compete with what tools it's given or what it has in the toolbox to help it develop itself. So, you know, we fought tooth and nail to maintain our corporation tax rate at 12.5%, and we have done that thus far. We're not for turning on it, I would think. And I think that level of certainty that corporates around the world see has been definitely a beneficial help. The other job has been educating other European states that actually our competition for these investments is not within Europe, it's actually with Singapore, Costa Rica, Israel. So the Intel fab plant, for example, the competitor was Israel, not within the European Union. So, you know, we as a society have done whatever it took to maintain a low corporation tax rate, and it's meant that we've maintained the flow after the heart attack over the last couple of years. Can that change? It might do, but I don't see it doing so right now. Quite apart from anything else, you know, we have taken a lot of debt onto our balance sheet, and if our European neighbours and compatriots want to get paid back, we need to maintain our model, I would say. So it's going to be one of the cornerstones of our future development, I would say. The other thing as well is there are very few places in Europe with as much connectivity as Dublin, for example, in terms of just cheap flights, cheap areas, and a relatively easy place to come to. And so it's very easy to get, like PayPal have hired 1,000 primarily Russian speakers into a town just north of Dublin Airport. There's very few places you can get where you can get 1,000 Russians to come pretty quickly, and yet you can do that in Dublin because the market around it is very positive, and the connectivity to, these would be primarily Latvian and Lithuanian Russians, who are comfortable to come here because they can get home for a weekend relatively cheaply. Europe is a very small place. So that's another unspoken value of the East Coast region of Ireland in particular.
Hugh Courtney, Dean of the DeMoor McKim School of Business, and again, thank you, Sean. One thing that I'd like you to comment on is you suggested, of course, that the Irish economy took a disproportionate share of the brunt of this, and partially for being the first to fall, as you suggested. I'm wondering if you could discuss a little bit about, you know, the social impact, the societal impact. For instance, is there resentment within, you know, the Irish people? If so, how does that play out? And if not, you know, why not? In other words, you could imagine a society that would react perhaps much more violently and poorly than we seem to have seen in Ireland. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I think I talked to you earlier on, Hugh, about this. There is an element of stoicism in Ireland, you know, in terms of we've been used to getting a pretty hard kicking for the last couple of 100 years, I guess, in some ways. So there's an element of that, I would say. But also, it is quite a stable society in terms of relatively high home ownership rates. If you own your home or you have an investment in your society, you want stability. And that helps. Wilbur Ross, who is a well-renowned investor, basically called the bottom of one of our biggest banks, Bank of Ireland, and took on a very significant share in that bank about 18 months ago. He's since tripled his money in doing it. And one of the things he gave an interview about it subsequently was that, you know, does it help your society having a riot, or does it help your society to build? And ultimately, I think it helps your society to build. So we haven't had the riots that you've seen in some of the other areas around the world. One of my board members is the country manager for Northern Trust, which is a kind of a back office facilitator of financial transactions in Ireland. They have 1,200 staff in Ireland. 1 in 10 Northern Trust, they're a Canadian firm. 1 in 10 Northern Trust staff are based in the world, are based in Ireland. And he tells me that what he wants is stability. What his CEO wants is stability. He wants to come to a market where he's happy, where he can get in and get out staff pretty easily, and the like. And so we've managed to do that pretty well. I'm trying to upload I'll see if I can get it going again in terms of on my memory stick. I just have a picture. You were in town in Dublin at the time of our budget last year, and there is a group who have been hurt, like welfare payments have been cut. It's taken a challenge to kind of reflect on. Any of you guys see the movie The Boxer, set here in Boston? You know the boxer's sisters are pretty tough sisters. Their cousins all live in Ireland, basically, if you know what I mean. And I've been in situations where the people affected by that have been, resentful and unhappy. It's on our Twitter account. But ultimately, the feeling, I would say, in the broader based society is it was somewhat unsustainable. We made some very significant gains in wealth. We did a once-in-a-generational catch-up between the 1980s and 2010. And yes, we've taken a very significant hit to our living standards. But fundamentally, when you look at the Daniel Libeskind designed theatre and the new Broadway, broadband, and the new motorways and everything else, it's still a fundamentally better and wealthier society than it was 30 years ago. So, on balance, it's been better, I would think. Just get the memory stick open there, so the picture, if I could get it there, sorry. Sorry for this.
I have another question, kind of to piggyback off of what Dean Courtney was asking. But in terms of the unemployment rate, especially, you mentioned that people are traveling to other countries like Australia and America. Do you feel like the unemployment rate is a little bit too skewed because of that, and because of there's so much movement out of Ireland? And also, in addition, is there any kind of compensation plan in the long run for people to deal with this kind of cut in welfare and cut in just all-around funding?
Yeah, definitely the unemployment rate has been cushioned by that fact. But actually, what I would say is there's been a huge outflux of people, but there also has been a huge influx of people. And actually, huge numbers of people would have gone to Australia, New Zealand, and East Coast US for 3 and 4 years. Many of them are coming back at the same time that others are heading away again. So it's a different kind of emigration to what would have been the case in earlier eras. Like if I, just from a microcosm point of view, my own 2 nephews, my sister has 2 kids who graduated from college 3 years ago. One guy has joined Jaguar in Birmingham, UK, making motor cars, and the other guy is working for Toshiba in Dusseldorf, Germany, managing East European markets there. That's a fantastic experience to get, with fantastic brands that will only benefit them in the next 35, 40 years of their careers. So is that emigration, or is that just skills chasing a better skill experience elsewhere, So I think it's, I think on balance it's probably been a good thing. The big shakeout has actually been for those with lesser skills. And classic in a downturn, the people who get hurt most anywhere in the world are the young, the less skilled, and the migrants or the immigrants. And the immigrants have actually held their own, I would say, if you look at the analyses. They've been probably more competitive, and they've been more, they were more willing to, grind it out there, if you know what I mean. But the young and the less skilled, in particular the less skilled, have had the big shakeout. So retail, it's taken a hammering in terms of jobs, for example. And that's a classic job for people with less skills, if you know what I mean. And that's been something that we face in terms of upskilling that element of the workforce, I would say. Does that answer your question? Or yeah. I'd be pleased to answer any questions, but anybody wants to talk to me afterwards as well, obviously. So thank you very much, and thank you to Wells Fargo and the school as well, and to Albert.